Well, welcome everyone. I'm so glad you're here. We're going to discuss Pell Grant eligibility and transparency in this session. I'm Mila Tappan, Manager of College Access and Outreach at FAME, and I'm thrilled that you could be here as part of this session. So it is being recorded. So if you have other people who would like to listen afterwards, you want to re-listen, it will be posted to our website next week. All right, so let's get started. Let's start with some of the real basic things about a Pell Grant. The Federal Pell Grant program is the largest of all of the federal grant programs in the education realm. Pell Grants are, what we often hear talked about on the campaign trail and things like that. So Pell Grants are, pretty well-known type of grant program. To meet the general eligibility requirements, a student must be an undergraduate who has not yet earned or completed requirements for a bachelor's or a professional degree. So basically, what we mean by that is if once you've earned your bachelor's degree, you're no longer eligible for a Pell Grant. So students who are working on an advanced degree and already have a bachelor's degree are not eligible. And students who have one bachelor's degree and go on to pursue a second bachelor's degree are also not eligible for a Pell Grant. So earning that first bachelor's degree is the goal of the Pell Grant. And once people have earned that, they are no longer eligible. There is an exception for teacher certification. So sometimes teachers are going to get certified, and in some cases, they can get a Pell Grant. But here in Maine, we don't see that because the only time you can is if you're attending a school where you cannot earn a bachelor's degree in teacher education. And in Maine, we just don't see that happening. So for all intents and purposes, if a student already has a bachelor's degree, they are not eligible for a Pell Grant. Additionally, the student has to be studying at an in-country institution. So you might be aware of the fact that students can actually get federal student loans outside of the country. So if students are attending, colleges in Europe or in Canada, if they have, an agreement signed with the U.S. Department of Education and they're accredited and all of that, in many cases, those students can borrow federal student loans at those foreign institutions. But that is not the case in terms of the Pell Grant. So they cannot take a Pell Grant with them out of the country. So they have to be here in the US studying at an eligible institution in order to receive a Pell Grant. And then, of course, they have to qualify based on one now of three sets of criteria in order to be eligible for Pell Grant. And this is going to look at the student's family situation and income eligibility. So with the new FAFSA, there are now three ways in which Pell Grant eligibility can be determined. So students can be determined eligible for a Pell Grant based on the maximum Pell Grant criteria. They can be determined to be eligible based on their calculated SAI, the calculated Pell Grant, or they might be eligible for a minimum Pell Grant based on the criteria that's been set out there. So what I'd like to do next is I want to go through each of those three categories and how they work and what the criteria is. So to be eligible for a maximum Pell Grant, again, this is brand new with this year, you are eligible as a student to receive a full Pell Grant or to receive a maximum Pell Grant, which this year is going to be, it looks like, $7,493. No, my gosh, Jen, put in the right amount. A dependent student whose parents or an independent student who is not required to file a federal income tax return is automatically eligible for a maximum Pell Grant. Okay, so if we have students or parents, independent students or parents of dependent students who are not required to file taxes, they are automatically eligible for a maximum Pell Grant. And notice I said they're not required to file. I'm not saying that they don't file. We know we have some people who don't file taxes who are indeed required to. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about individuals who are not required to file taxes. So where the transparency comes in, I'm going to mention this a couple of different times, is that if you're working with students, their parents don't have to file a tax return. They're not required to. That student's going to be eligible for a Pell Grant even before they file a FAFSA. Additionally, if a dependent student's parents or a single parent or independent student is a single parent with an AGI of greater than 0, but less than 225% of the poverty guidelines for family size, they are going to be eligible for a maximum Pell Grant. So AGI being adjusted gross income. So when people do file taxes, if their adjusted gross income is less than is more than zero, but less than 225% of the poverty guidelines, which we're going to look at in a moment, based on their family size, they will be eligible for a maximum Pell Grant. If we have a dependent student's parents, or not a single parent, or an independent student, not a parent, or not a single parent who has adjusted gross income of greater than zero, but less than 175% of poverty, they're going to be eligible for a maximum Pell Grant. Or if we have a student who's under the age of 33 who had a parent who died serving in the armed forces after 9/11 or in the line of duty as a public safety officer, that student will also be eligible for a Pell Grant, maximum Pell Grant. Now, I just want to say in that last category, that student is eligible for a maximum Pell Grant, but they are not automatically eligible for other types of aid. So their student aid index will determine what they're eligible for in terms of other types of financial aid. But because of their circumstances, they are indeed eligible for a maximum Pell Grant. And again, all of these things can be determined before a student files a FAFSA. So that's one way in which a student is eligible for a Pell Grant. Now, the other way, the second way, is based on their SAI, their Student Aid Index. So do they qualify for a calculated Pell Grant? So if a student is not eligible for a maximum Pell Grant, because if they're eligible for maximum, they're going to get the maximum. But if they're not eligible for a maximum Pell Grant, they may be eligible for a calculated Pell. So how a calculated Pell eligibility is determined is you take the calculated Pell Grant, 7,395. I just had a brain cramp there a moment ago. That's the maximum amount for this year. It appears it's probably going to be the maximum amount for next year as well. So you take the maximum Pell Grant and you subtract out the student aid index. Okay. So let's use this example. Maximum Pell of 7,395. Let's just say in this scenario, the student has an SAI of 1,005. Their calculated Pell eligibility is going to be the 7,395 minus the 1,005. They're going to be eligible for a Pell Grant of $6,390, assuming they're full time. Okay, we'll get into those details in just a moment. So for some of you, it might seem like, gosh, this is an obvious way to calculate Pell Grant eligibility, to take the maximum Pell minus the SAI, but this is brand new. In the past, all of us who I worked in financial aid years ago, and I know I have people on here who currently do, and we always had these charts, these spreadsheets, and you had to go find someone's EFC and then go down and figure out exactly how much Pell Grant they were eligible to receive. So what's nice now is if we know what the maximum Pell is and we know what someone's SAI is, we can tell them not only whether or not they're eligible for a Pell Grant, but we can tell them approximately how much or exactly how much in a Pell Grant they would be eligible for if they were attending full time. So that's way number two in which a student can be considered eligible for a Pell Grant. The third way is to determine whether or not they're eligible for a minimum Pell. And as we go down through the minimum Pell requirements, I just want to say a student, if they qualify for a Pell Grant based on more than one of these criteria, so let's say they qualify based on the SAI criteria that we just talked about, or they qualify based on this minimum Pell Grant criteria, they're always going to get the largest Pell Grant that they qualify for. Okay, so if they qualify for minimum and they qualify for a scheduled based on their SAI, if the SAI Pell Grant eligibility is higher, they will get the higher. Okay, so always trying to do things, I think, that favor the student. So in order to be eligible for a minimum Pell Grant, an independent student that is a single parent with an adjusted gross income of less than 400% of poverty will be eligible for the minimum Pell. A dependent student's parent who is a single parent with an AGI of less than 325% of the poverty guidelines based on family size will be eligible for a minimum. And in just a moment, we're going to look at those guidelines. A dependent student's parent who is not a single parent or an independent student is not a parent and has an AGI of less than 275 or equal to 275% of poverty based on family size will be eligible for a minimum Pell Grant. And an independent student who is a parent but is not a single parent and has an AGI of less than or equal to 350% of poverty based on their family size will be eligible for a minimum Pell Grant. Okay, so this is how individuals would qualify for a minimum Pell Grant. Now, the minimum Pell Grant amount is going to be 10% of the maximum Pell Grant. So let's just do, I made the math a little bit easier here. So let's just say we're in a year where the maximum Pell Grant is $7,500, because again, sometimes that changes each year, then the minimum Pell Grant would be $750. One of the big things about being eligible for a Pell Grant, even a minimum Pell Grant, and I'm not dismissing, 700 and some dollars. That's a big deal. That still is a really important amount of money. But one of the other benefits of qualifying for a Pell Grant is oftentimes it will open you up for eligibility to other programs. So sometimes, for example, some of the schools have had free tuition. So a student's tuition will be fully covered if they are Pell Grant eligible. So just being Pell Grant eligible can have significant benefits to students. So it's not just about the additional money, although that matters. It's also about the other opportunities that are opened up. So Pell Grant eligibility, maximum, calculated, minimum. So now let's look at some tables, because I think this is where it really starts to become a little bit more clear what this really means to families. So when we talk about minimum and maximum Pels, we talked about them being based on the poverty tables. So in this case, for the 24-25 FAFSAs that are being filed currently, those are based on 2022 income. So when we're talking about which poverty tables are being used, we're using the poverty tables for 2022. So we're always going to use the year's worth of tables that equate to the year of income on the FAFSA. And we always talk about prior year. So what you want to do to figure out what year that's going to be is you want to look at the year the FAFSA is, in this case 24-25, and you go 2 years back from the first number. So 2024, 2 years back, 2022 is the income that's being used to determine eligibility on the 24-25 FAFSA, and it is the income that's being used to determine eligibility for minimum and maximum Pell Grants. Okay, let's look at this. So in this scenario, because we've got 5 different charts I'm going to show you, the dependent student's parent is single. Okay, so let's just say we've got a single parent and there are 2 kids. So there's, let's say, mom, and then the student, and then a younger sibling. So we have a family size of 3. So what you're going to find here is that this student will qualify for a maximum Pell Grant if mom's income is less than 225% of poverty. What that equates to for a family size of 3 is if mom's income is under 51,818, that student is going to be eligible for a maximum Pell Grant. Again, we know that before the student ever files the FAFSA. Now, of course, they do have to file the FAFSA, and we want to be sure that people know that in order to get a Pell Grant, you have to file the FAFSA. Even if your eligibility can be determined before you file, you still have to file a FAFSA. Now, let's just say that mom's income is a little bit higher than that. As long as mom's income is less than $74,848, the student will be eligible for a minimum Pell. Now, the student, again, might be eligible for a calculated Pell as well. And if they are, whatever of those options is the highest Pell Grant, that is what the student will be eligible to receive. But you can see that in this scenario, again, parent is a single parent, how high the income amounts can be. Now, obviously, these are larger family sizes. So that's, you got to have a lot more money to have a larger family. But you can see that it really, really can have a significant income and be eligible for a minimum, or especially a maximum or a minimum Pell Grant. All right, let's look at the next one. So in this scenario, the student's a dependent student still, but the parent is not single. So if we have a married couple, and let's just say they have 2 kids. So in that scenario, we've got a family of 4. The student is eligible for a maximum Pell Grant if the family's income is below 48,563 for this particular year, or a minimum Pell Grant all the way up to 76,313. Okay, so they're eligible for either maximum, minimum, but again, we're going to calculate them in a calculated Pell as well. An independent student, if they're a single parent, let's just say they have 2 kiddos, a single parent with 2 kiddos, they can receive a maximum Pell if their income in this scenario is under $51,818, or minimum Pell even with an income up as high as just over $92,000. And look here, larger families, look how high the income can be and still qualifying for a minimum Pell Grant. If a student is an independent student and they're a parent, but they're not a single parent, so they're married, then you're going to see that the incomes are a little bit less. This is much more equivalent to like the dependent student whose parents are married. There's a lot of similarities between those requirements. So 48,563, family of four again, two parents, two kids, maximum Pell Grant up to 97,000, a little over 97, still eligible for a minimum Pell Grant. And then the last one I wanted to show you, this is our independent students who are not parents. You're going to see that they are eligible for a maximum Pell Grant if they earn less than 23,783. So my youngest son is now actually an independent student based on age. He's finishing up school in May, so he won't be attending school next year, I don't think anyway. But basically, he's been going to school and working part-time. And so what I could know today is that if he does go to school next year and he does the FAFSA, that if his income for 2022 is less than 23,000, which it was because he was only working part-time, 23,783, he'd be eligible for a maximum Pell Grant. So we know that ahead of time. He'd be eligible for at least a minimum Pell Grant if his income was up to 37,000. So I hope seeing those charts and kind of being able to put into context for the different scenarios, how much eligibility for Pell Grant has expanded. It's really, really exceptional. So what we want people to know is that these tables do live on our website. So you can go to our website and you can find these tables. We will also have this presentation, of course, linked from our FA 101 page. So keep your eye out on these, and I think we just want to be talking about this early awareness piece, because so often we hear students, especially from lower income families, just think that it's not possible for them to go to school. And so they kind of, decide not to go so early in the process, where maybe if they know up front that they could be eligible for Pell Grants, yes, they do have to still go through the process. We're hopeful that that will mean that more students will go ahead and do that. Of course, if you have any questions in the meantime, as I go through this, please either take yourself off mute and feel free to ask. We're a pretty small group, or go ahead and put it in the chat. So there is this chart that I know looks a little bit confusing, but I do think it's handy. So I have it printed off at my desk, but I love color coding. So basically what I can see here is that if a dependent student's parent or an independent student themselves was not required to file a tax return, then I can see that they're going to be eligible for a maximum Pell. They are going to actually have a negative SAI, a negative 1,500 SAI. And then all other aid will be calculated based on their SAI, and they won't have any asset questions that will be factored into their financial aid eligibility. So that tells me that. If I can see that the student is one of those whose parents died in the line of duty, then I can see, okay, here they're eligible for a maximum Pell. That's great. And then, as we mentioned, their other aid will be based on their SAI, which could be much higher depending on their financial circumstances. So I won't go through all of this, but you can see basically that this is a great way to get a quick snapshot if you're one of those visual people of who is eligible under what circumstances and for what type of Pell, maximum, minimum, or calculated. So now let's talk about scheduled awards and this concept of a scheduled award, because this is going to lay some of the foundation for the things that we're going to be talking about in the upcoming slides. Yes, this flowchart is available. So James, I certainly can get it to you, but I can send it to anyone who's interested in receiving it. So I'll make myself a note right now to do that. Okay, so the scheduled award is the maximum amount a student can receive during the award year if the student attends full-time for a full academic year. Okay? So we're going to keep coming back to this scheduled award. So basically, if I've got a student, we're going to keep it really simple today. We're going to think about students who are attending a semester-based school. So let's think about a student who is going to school in the fall and in the spring, and they're going full-time for the fall, they're going full-time for the spring. Their scheduled award would be the maximum amount they can receive for that period of time. At a semester-based school, an academic year is defined as 30 weeks or 2 semesters. Now we have programs that get much more complicated, but we're going to keep it simple here today. So for that student who is attending a semester-based school, they're going full-time in the fall, full-time in the spring, they're going to get one scheduled award for that period of time. For example, if a student who is eligible for a maximum Pell, we're going to go based on the 73.95, that would be their scheduled award for that year. Okay. So for a student who is eligible for a maximum Pell, they would have a scheduled award of 73.95. That they're eligible for that maximum Pell, and that's what their scheduled award would be for that period of time. So kind of keep that in mind. I think it's going to become much more clear what I'm talking about in just a moment. To receive a full scheduled award, students must be enrolled full-time. So in a moment, we're going to talk more about this concept of enrollment intensity. So a student who is attending school full-time could receive, for that scheduled award, 73.95. Full-time enrollment is defined by the institution, and for undergraduate programs, it must comprise at least 12 credit hours. So what you're often going to find is that at a semester-based school, students are going to be considered full-time if they take at least 12 credits. But it is defined by the school, but it does have to be at least 12. Now, keep in mind, though, in order to graduate in 4 years, which is what we talk about when we talk about bachelor's degrees, students actually have to be enrolled on an average of 15 credits per semester. So there is a little bit of a disconnect for what's considered to be full-time to get Pell Grant eligibility and what the school might require as full-time to receive other types of aid. I'm not 100% sure of this, but I know that the University of Maine at Orono, for example, for a period of time, in order to get some of their funding, they could get a Pell Grant if they were taking 12 credits. But in order to get some of their other funding, they had to be 15 credits per semester. But 12 is the minimum. That's what you typically see when we're talking about Pell Grant eligibility. For Pell Grant eligible students enrolled less than full-time, the award amounts are based on enrollment intensity, basically based on how many credits they're taking. I do see that there's a question there. I'm going to hold tight and read the question in just a moment. Let me get through this intensity piece, and then I'll look at the questions to see if they're applicable to what we're talking about right now. Okay, so here is a new concept. So it used to be up until this year that we're in now, 24-25, that basically Pell Grant eligibility, you would either get a Pell Grant if you were full-time, you get the full amount of Pell Grant. If you were 9, 10, or 11 credits, you would be considered 3/4 time, and you get 3/4 of a Pell Grant. If you were enrolled for 6, 7, or 8 credits, you would be considered half-time, and you would get a certain amount of Pell Grant, the half of a Pell Grant, and then less than half-time would be a different amount. So one of the changes they've made is that the Pell Grant amounts actually are differing within those cells. So if we look at that 3/4 time cell, for example, it used to be that a student who was taking 9 credits would get the same amount of Pell Grant as a student who is taking 11 credits. But now that is no longer the case. A student who is taking 9 credits is considered 3/4 time in this scenario. A student taking 11 credits is considered 3/4 time, but the student taking 11 credits is going to be eligible for a larger amount of Pell Grant. So what you're doing is you're taking 12 being full-time, and you're dividing the number of credits by that 12. So if a student is taking 11 credit hours, they're going to get 92% of their Pell Grant award. So I'm going to make the math easier here. Let's just say in this scenario, the student is eligible, I'm making this up on the fly, is eligible for $4,000 in a Pell Grant. Okay, so you're going to take 4,000, you're going to multiply it times 92, and let's just say that there are 11 credits both semesters. That's going to be split between the fall and the spring. Okay. If they are enrolled for 10 credits, you're going to take that 4,000 award and you're going to multiply it times 83%. So that is very different than it used to be in the past. So 3/4 time, you're going to actually have different amounts for students who are 11 credits versus 9. The same thing with halftime. So it used to be in the past that if a student was eligible for a full Pell Grant of $4,000, if they were attending halftime all year long, let's keep it nice, simple, and straight, they would be eligible for a maximum of $2,000 in Pell Grant. They get half of that because they're enrolled half-time. But now, if that's still the case if they're 6 credits, but if they're 7 or 8 credits, they're actually going to get a little bit more. So again, a new concept. So Pell Grant eligibility is still categorized. You might still put someone in a bucket of being 3/4 time or half time, but the exact amount that they're going to receive will vary even within those 3/4 or half time buckets. Okay? So I'm going to take a moment and I am going to look at the questions and see if they're related to that. All righty, let me see. Oh, great. Thank you. It was already shared. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate that. Okay. Yeah, if you have any questions at all, please make sure that you put them in the chat. That's wonderful. We don't have the Q&A. This is a meeting, so it doesn't have the Q&A. Those questions in the chat are super helpful. Okay. Any questions about enrollment intensity? And again, I want you to feel free to take yourself off mute and ask a question if you have it. Again, some of the changes they've made to Pell, I think, are obvious, and it might seem like maybe they should have always done it this way, because if you're taking, 6 credits versus 8 credits, it is costing you more money. So it's nice now that the Pell Grant is kind of reflecting the fact that it's schools that charge on a per credit basis, that extra cost, they're going to get a little bit of extra Pell Grant to help pay for those extra credits. All right, if there are no questions there, let's move on and talk about year-round Pell. So we did a nice simple scenario first to start with, that the student is going to school in the fall full-time, they're going to school in the spring full-time. But some students go to school all year round. For a matter of fact, we're seeing this much more often than we used to. So students can now, wasn't always the case, students can now get up to 150% of a scheduled award for an award year. So let's look at this scenario. So if we've got a student who is attending in the fall and the spring, but they also want to go in the summer, they can potentially get Pell Grant eligibility in the summer. So that's a really great thing. So when we talk about students taking summer classes, one of the things that we want to keep in mind is how that particular school that they're attending treats the summer. And this is important for a couple of reasons. So schools can either look at summer as a header, as the beginning of their academic year, or a trailer. So it falls at the end of their academic year. So used to work at Orono, and I think they still do it the same way. We always treated summer as a trailer. So what that meant is our academic year ran fall, spring, summer. So back in the day, the student could only get a Pell Grant in that summer if they went to school less than full time during the academic year. But now, even students who attend school full time in the fall and in the spring and have used up 100% of their scheduled award can still have Pell Grant eligibility available to them if they're attending in the summer. Okay? Other schools, again, start their year off with the summer. UMA, to my knowledge, is one of these schools. So summer kicks off their year. So let's just say we're talking about the 24-25 academic year. It's going to be summer, fall, and then spring. So that's going to be their full academic year. So a student can go to school in the summer and get some Pell and still go to school full time in the fall and the spring and get the full-time Pell Award, that full scheduled award, because the scheduled award can exceed 100%. It can actually be 100 up to 150%. So you think about an academic year nowadays, it's not as it's much more common than it used to be that students basically have 3 terms, right? They have fall, they have spring, and they have summer. And the Pell Grant program has been adjusted to reflect that. So for this example, if they're going full-time in the academic year and full-time in the summer, and summer is a trailer, the student's scheduled award is $6,000, okay? So their scheduled award, where we started back a moment ago, is $6,000. So they received, $3,000 in the fall, and 3,000 in the spring. So their scheduled award, which was, for the fall and the spring, full time, they got 3,000 in the fall, 3,000 in the spring. They've used up a scheduled award, 100% of a scheduled award. But because they can get up to 150% of a scheduled award, they can attend full time in the summer or less than full time and get up to $3,000 in Pell Grant for the summer as well. Okay. The other reason I wanted to talk about headers and trailers are related to actual FAFSA filing. So one of the things that we're a little bit concerned about this year with FAFSAs being delayed and processing being delayed is that for schools like a UMA, and I know there are others out there, summer starts their academic year, so they are header schools, which means as soon as May, they need to be using the 24-25 FAFSA to determine eligibility. So I just want to throw that out there, that there are some schools that, it's one thing, we all are feeling very, very behind this year, but for many students, their financial aid based on this FAFSA won't be in effect until the fall semester. But there are schools who treat summer as a header, who will be having summer classes, and the students potentially have Pell Grant eligibility, that the 24-25 FAFSA that have not yet been processed are what need to be in and ready to go in order for students to get their Pell Grants over the summer. So just wanted to mention that little fact. But when you're working with students, and they say they want to attend in the summer, one of the really important things to do is to have them check with their school that they're going to be attending and to find out whether they are a header or a trailer. Because again, at a UMA, they're a header, so this coming summer is covered by the 24-25 FAFSA. At Orono, which is a trailer, this summer is covered by the 23-24 FAFSA, okay? So we want to make sure that students know what FAFSA they need to get completed when they're planning to attend in the summer. Now I'd like to talk about lifetime eligibility used, or what we call LEU. So there is a lifetime eligibility limit to Pell Grants. So a student's maximum duration of Pell Grant eligibility is 6 scheduled awards. So going back to that scheduled award again. So one scheduled award equals 100% of their lifetime eligibility used. So why this is an issue is once a student hits 600% of their LEU, they are no longer eligible for a Pell Grant. But let's back up for a moment and talk about what this means in reality. So if a student is attending full-time fall and spring, kind of back to when I was in school, that's what most people did, right? You went to school in the fall, you went to school full-time in the fall, full-time in the spring, and then during the summer, took a break, maybe, working and all of that. For students doing that, they would be able to receive 6 years of Pell Grant. So it's not like the Pell Grant is, okay, you got to go full time for 4 years and you're only getting funding for 4 years. They actually build in some buffer for all sorts of reasons. So basically, a student that's in a 4-year program, going to school, full time fall and spring, can get Pell Grant for up to 6 years. Okay. Now, if a student was attending half-time and they're just going in the fall and the spring, they're going just for one scheduled award per year, basically, they would be able to get Pell Grant funding for up to 12 years, okay? Up to 12 years. So they're getting the half-time amount instead of, 6 years of full-time, they can get 12 years of part-time. But then we also have students who are attending full-time in the fall, spring, and summer. So they're getting that 150% of a scheduled award, all in one calendar year. In that scenario, they can basically, let's say they're consistent about that, they could receive a Pell Grant for 4 years, okay? Because they're getting, basically 3 semesters per year. So they're still getting a total of 12 semesters of full time, just like that first scenario here, where a student is attending full-time in the fall and spring, are basically getting 12 semesters of full-time Pell Grant. Now, I made it nice and simple, right? But we know it's anything but. So this is how it works. But the reality is that sometimes students go full-time, sometimes they go part-time, sometimes they go in the summer, sometimes they don't go in the summer. So calculating LEUs can get a bit more complicated. So when the student files their FAFSA, there is information that's provided that, lets people know, okay, this is how much of your Pell Grant lifetime eligibility you have used so that students can keep track of it. Most of the time, there is a sufficient amount. That's why, for a standard 4-year degree, you have 6 years worth of eligibility because things happen, right? Sometimes students withdraw, sometimes they are taking the 12 credits instead of the 15. So they are full time, but they're not able to graduate in 4 years because they haven't earned enough credits yet. So this current structure for the Pell Grant does take those situations into account. And we know Pell Grants are so critical to students being able to, earn their degrees. And without being Pell Grant eligible, they often can't do that. All right. This one I told you was a shorter session. We really just did a high-level discussion of Pell Grant eligibility for schools that are, have different scenarios. There are all sorts of different scenarios out there. You think about schools that, are based on the number of weeks, and they have multiple starting programs at different times throughout the year, modules and stuff like that. This all gets much more complicated. But for the purposes of today, I just wanted to kind of do that overview for the standard situation because I think most of you probably are not living in the weeds of Pell Grant eligibility. But knowing that I do have some financial aid people on the call, or I could say the call, you know what I mean, on the Zoom, is there anything that you would like to add that you think I didn't maybe clarify, or that is just important information on top of what I've already said? Not to put anyone on the spot. You can volunteer to speak if you'd like to. Okay. Well, anything else? Any other questions? I'm going to take down the screen because it just says questions. So let's turn that off. Um, thank you so much to all of you. I mean, you guys, it's just, I look at you and I think about, how I've been so fortunate to interact with you all for all these years, and gosh, your students are lucky. So, yeah, they're so fortunate to have your support to get them through this. So, all righty. All right, so Steve did put in the chat the closing session. So if we are ready, I'm going to move over. I'll close this out and we can move over there. All right. Thank you again so much. Okay. Talk to you soon.